The first time he saw the Bruises, they were the color of a dying sunset, dark purple fading into sickly yellow, peeking from beneath the lace of her sleeve like secrets begging to be told. And Wade Callahan had spent enough years riding under hard skies to know that secrets like that never healed on their own. They festered, they rotted, and they ruined souls. And as he stood there in the dusty street, with the wind pushing tumbleweeds past his boots, he felt something in his chest tighten the way it used to before a gunfight, slow and certain. Like fate tapping him on the shoulder. Red Hollow was the kind of town that pretended not to notice things. The saloon doors creaked, the whiskey flowed, the piano played sour tunes in the corner, and men laughed too loud to drown out their conscience. But Wade noticed. He always did, ever since he'd come back from the war with a scar down his ribs and a habit of watching hands instead of faces. He noticed how Clara Bennett kept her eyes low, how she flinched when someone reached too quick, how her husband, Tom Bennett, gripped her elbow just a little too tight when he led her across the boardwalk. Wade had sworn off trouble when he bought his small patch of land just outside town, swore he'd live quiet, tend horses, mend fences, and let the world spin without him. But trouble had a way of finding men who thought they were done with it. And that afternoon when he stepped into Miller's general store for coffee beans and found Clara standing by the fabric rolls with her wrist half hidden under ribbon, he saw the shadow beneath her skin and knew peace was fixing to leave him again. She smiled when she noticed him looking, but it was the kind of smile folks wore to funerals, polite and thin and meant to keep questions at bay. Tom stood a few feet off, arguing about feed prices, his voice sharp as barbed wire. And when he turned back toward her, she straightened quick, tugged her sleeve down farther, but not before Wade caught sight of fingerprints darkened against pale flesh. And in that moment the air felt heavy, like a storm rolling in over the plains. He did not speak of it that day, not in the store, not in the street, because Wade understood pride and he understood fear. And he knew calling out a man in public only made him crueler in private. So he tipped his hat, paid for his goods, and stepped back into the blazing afternoon sun with his jaw clenched tight enough to crack stone, telling himself it was none of his business, telling himself Clara was married and grown and capable of handling her own affairs. But his mind kept drifting back to the color of those bruises that night. The wind carried, shouting across the fields, thin and sharp like a blade drawn slow from its sheath, and Wade froze on his porch, coffee cooling in his hand as the sound drifted from the direction of the Bennett house. He could not make out words, only tone, harsh and furious, followed by a crash that split the quiet wide open. And though he stood there a long minute wrestling with ghosts of his own past, he finally set the cup aside and reached for his hat. He did not go charging in like some reckless hero from dime novels. He walked steady, boots pressing into dirt, eyes fixed on the lamplight flickering through the Bennett's window. And when he reached the gate he paused, hearing nothing now but silence thick as mud. He knocked once, firm and deliberate, and after a stretch that felt like eternity, Clara answered, her hair loose around her shoulders, her lips split just enough to show red against pale skin. Tom appeared behind her, eyes cold and calculating, and Wade held his ground, meeting that stare without flinching, saying in a voice calm as still water that he had heard shouting and wanted to make sure everything was square. Tom laughed, low and mocking, claimed it was a private matter between husband and wife, and maybe it was, maybe the law would say the same. But as Wade looked at Clara and saw fear flicker before she masked it, something inside him settled hard and final. And though he turned and walked away that night without drawing blood, he made himself a quiet vow under the wide, indifferent stars that no matter the cost, no matter the consequence, he would not let her suffer in silence again. Not while he still had breath in his lungs and iron at his hip. Morning came hard and bright over Red Hollow, but Wade Callahan felt none of its warmth. He had not slept more than a handful of minutes, each time drifting off, only to see again the split at Clara Bennett's lip and the fear she tried to hide behind lowered lashes. And as he saddled his bay mare in the pale light, he understood something plain and bitter. A man could ride from trouble, could bury himself in work and whiskey and distance. But some fights chose you, and once they did, there was no honest turning away. Word traveled fast in small towns, not about bruises, not about shouting in the night, but about anything that might distract from such things. And by midday the talk at the saloon circled cattle prices and a drifting herd sighted near the river. Tom Bennett sat at a corner table holding court, laughing loud, slapping backs, playing the part of upstanding rancher, and Wade watched from the bar, saying little, measuring the man's temper in the tightness of his jaw and the way his hand curled possessively around his whiskey glass. It was not lost on Wade that Tom's ranch bordered his own land, that their fences ran near enough to share dust when the wind kicked up, and as the afternoon wore thin he rode the boundary line, checking posts, noting where wire sagged, and he found more than loose staples. He found a car from his herd wandering near Bennett property, with a fresh welt along its flank, struck hard and mean, and Wade crouched beside the trembling animal with a slow burn rising in his chest, because cruelty did not confine itself to one target. It spilled over into whatever was weaker. That evening he saw Clara again, this time at the well behind the church, her sleeves rolled, despite the heat fading, and though she tried to move quickly past him, he stepped gentle into her path, not blocking, just close enough to be heard without witnesses, and he said her name low, asked if she was safe, and for a long breath she said nothing, only stared at the ground where dust swirled around her boots, until finally she whispered that safe was a word she barely remembered. She did not spill everything at once. Pain rarely comes tidy and organized. It comes tangled and ashamed, and Clara spoke in pieces, about tempers sparked by small things, about accusations that made no sense, about apologies that came with flowers one day and bruises the next. She insisted Tom had not always been this way, that once he had been charming, ambitious, full of plans for the future, and Wade listened without interruption, knowing better than to crowd a confession that cost so much to give. When she lifted her eyes to his, there was something different there, not hope exactly, but exhaustion too deep to hide, and she asked him the question that broke whatever restraint he had left. She asked if a woman had any right to want peace in her own home, and Wade answered without hesitation that she had every right God ever granted a soul, and more than that, she had a right to live without fear. His voice steady but edged with iron. Tom saw them speaking. Of course he did. Jealousy sharpens a man's sight, and before the sun slipped fully behind the hills, he strode across the yard toward them, boots pounding like warning drums. He accused, he threatened, he wrapped his hand around Clara's arm, in a grip that made her wince, and Wade stepped forward then, not drawing his gun, not raising his voice, but placing himself square between them, telling Tom plain that any man who laid hands in anger would answer for it. The street had gone quiet, neighbors pretending to tend chores while watching from corners of their eyes, because Red Hollow had long practiced the art of looking away. But something shifted that evening. Perhaps it was the way Wade stood, unyielding. Perhaps it was the way Clara did not lower her gaze this time. And though Tom spat words and swore vengeance, and dragged her home with fury simmering, he knew now that he was being watched, and as Wade remained in the fading light, with dust curling around his boots, he understood the line had been drawn, and once a line like that marked the earth, someone would eventually have to cross it, and when that day came, he intended to be ready the night it happened. The sky hung low and heavy over Red Hollow, clouds swallowing the moon until the world felt smaller, tighter, like it was holding its breath, and Wade Callahan sensed it before the first shout ever split the dark. He was sitting at his kitchen table, oiling his revolver out of habit more than need, when the wind shifted and carried a sound across the fields, not just anger this time, but fear sharp and breaking, and his chair scraped back before his mind finished deciding. He rode hard, hooves thundering against dry earth, every stride fueled by the vow he had made beneath those same indifferent stars. And as he reached the Bennett house, he saw lamplight flickering wild through the window, shadows crashing against walls. He did not knock this time. He pushed through the door with a force that rattled hinges, and the scene inside burned itself into memory. Clara pressed against the table, Tom towering over her with a raised hand and murder in his eyes. There are moments in a man's life when the world narrows to a single breath, a single choice, and Wade's voice cut through the room low and lethal, telling Tom to step back, the words carrying weight enough to bend iron. Tom turned, fury twisting his features, and for a heartbeat no one moved, the air thick with the promise of violence. Then Tom reached not for Clara, but for the rifle propped against the wall, and that was the crossing of the line. The gunshot shattered the night like thunder splitting stone, smoke curling between them, and when it cleared, Tom Bennett lay on the wooden floor, shock frozen across his face, the rifle untouched by his hand. Wade stood steady, though his ears rang and his pulse roared like a river in flood. He had not wanted blood, had not come seeking death. but he had come prepared to end what needed ending. And as neighbors gathered at the doorway, wide-eyed and whispering, they saw not a brawl but a boundary defended. The sheriff arrived with questions heavy as chains, but witnesses spoke up this time. They spoke of shouting heard too often, of bruises glimpsed and ignored, of threats muttered in public that now carried sharper meaning, and for once Red Hollow did not look away. Wade told his part plain and simple, that he had warned the man, that he had given him space to step back, and that when Tom reached for a rifle, he had chosen his own fate. Clara sat wrapped in a borrowed shawl on the porch as dawn crept over the horizon, her face pale but unbroken, and when the sheriff finally nodded and declared it self-defense, the words seemed to lift something invisible from her shoulders. She did not cry, not at first. She simply breathed, slow and deep, as if tasting freedom for the first time in years, and Wade stood a few paces away, giving her room yet staying close enough to remind her she was not alone. Days passed, then weeks, and the Bennett house no longer echoed with anger. Clara sold the property and moved into a small cottage near the edge of town. She began helping at the schoolhouse, her laughter tentative at first but growing steadier, and though whispers lingered, as they always do in places like Red Hollow, they carried less bite than before, because folks had witnessed what silence could cost, and what courage could change one evening as the sun bled gold across the plains. Clara found Wade mending fence along the border of his land. She approached without fear in her step, without sleeves tugged low to hide shame, and she thanked him not just for the bullet fired, but for the promise made long before it, the promise that she would never be hurt again if he had strength left to stand. Wade tipped his hat, eyes soft beneath the brim, and told her the truth plain and steady, that no one could erase the past, but from this day forward, any hand raised in anger would find him in the way, and under the vast western sky where dust met horizon, that promise felt stronger than steel, stronger than fear, and strong enough to build a life on, free at last from the bruises she once hid in silence.